Math 4, let's talk about comparative experiments. I can design comparative experiments using sampling methods and collect and analyze data to answer a statistical question. What is an experiment? An experiment is a controlled study in which the researcher attempts to understand cause and effect relationships. The study is controlled in the sense that the researcher controls, number one, how subjects are assigned to groups, and two, which treatments each group receives. A researcher deliberately applies a treatment before observing the responses in an experiment. There are two main types of statistical experiments. Controlled experiments. The conditions are very controlled, and there's only one factor that differs between the groups. Comparative experiments. There are less controlled conditions, and there are two or more factors that differ between groups. An example of a controlled experiment, let's say we take 5 identical pots. We fill each with a different type of soil, plant identical bean seeds in each pot, place the pots in a sunny window, water them equally, and measure how long it takes for the seeds in each pot to sprout. The only difference is the type of soil. A comparative experiment, if we take our potted plant example and put some in a shadier spot or water some more than others, we change this experiment to a comparative experiment. There are multiple variables we are observing. We often call these variables effects. The combination of effects or variables a researcher considers is called an experimental condition. Experimental conditions are more commonly referred to as treatments. An extraneous factor is one that is not of interest to the study, but is thought to affect the response or how the subject responds. If we think about our potted plant example, an extraneous factor could be the weather. Humidity level could be an extraneous factor. Humidity isn't one of the variables the researcher is studying, but it might influence the outcome of the study. If you are unable to determine the effect of 2 or more extraneous factors, those factors are said to be confounded. Let's say our potted plants were outside. Then the amount of wind and the temperature could be extraneous factors. It would be hard to distinguish between the effects of wind and temperature in the study. The amount of wind and temperature changes are considered confounding variable. The response variable is the dependent or the y variable in an experiment. In our potted plant experiment, the growth of the plant is the response variable. It is the response or the result we are measuring. It's the focus of the experiment. The explanatory variable is the independent or the x variable in an experiment. In our potted plant experiment, the type of soil is the explanatory variable. It is what causes the result we are measuring. So if we are to plot our results on a graph, the response variable is on the y-axis and the explanatory variable is on the x-axis. The design of an experiment is the plan for conducting the experiment. Key concepts in experimental design are randomization, blocking, direct control, and replication. Let's say we want to determine how 4 classes of Math 4 students' performance is affected by room temperature. The rooms would be set to 65 degrees for 2 of the classes, and then 70 degrees for 2 of the classes. Then, compare the scores for the 65-degree group and the 70-degree group. EOC scores could be an extraneous factor. Often students who work harder have higher EOC grades. Randomization. Random assignment of subjects to treatments or of treatments to trials to ensure that the experiment does not systematically favor one treatment over another. This helps create groups that are as much alike as possible. It allows for minimum distortion caused by extraneous factors. We could achieve randomization if our Math 4 students were assigned to classes by a random schedule creator. EOC scores would not play a part in class grouping. Using extraneous factors to create blocks or groups that are similar based on the extraneous factors. All experimental conditions or treatments are then tried in each block. We could create groups that are much alike as possible, allows for minimum distortion caused by extraneous factors. All classes are selected by EOC scores. Then each class would be randomly split for the test into 2 rooms, one at 65 degrees and one at 70 degrees. So here's a little visual. So if we have all of the Math 4 students all put in this pile, we split them into 4 classes, one with EOC scores less than 2, that's a 2. One with EOC scores between 2 and 3. One with EOC scores between 3 and 4. So let's say this is 2 is less than X is less than or equal to 3. And then we have EOC scores between 3 and 4 and EOC score above 4. So there's my 4 classes. They're separated by blocks or groups, the EOC scores. Then each of those blocks is randomly picked into 2 different groups. So that means each of these blocks is evenly divided so that everybody is well represented in the 70 degrees and everybody is well represented in the 65 degrees. Direct control. Holding extraneous factors constant so that their effects are not confounded with those of the experimental conditions or the treatments. Consider our experiment about room temperature affecting test scores. The researcher can't control EOC scores, but what about background noise? Background noise isn't what is being studied, but it can affect the outcome. The researcher can control background noise by eliminating unnecessary traffic in the hallways or announcements, etc. The researcher is applying direct control over an extraneous factor, the background noise. Replication. That's the repetition of an experiment under the same or similar conditions. You make multiple observations of each experimental condition. Together with randomization, this allows the researcher to be reasonably sure of the accuracy of the results. Will a different researcher get the same results? If someone else cannot get the same results, then no one will take this experiment seriously. So replication is very important. Before proceeding with an experiment, you should be able to answer the following 10 questions. What is the question that the data from the experiment will be able to answer? What is the response variable? How will the values from the response variable be determined? What are the factors for the experiment? For each factor, how many different values are there, and what are these values? What are the treatments for the experiments? What extraneous factors might influence the response? How does the design incorporate randomization? How does the design protect against potential extraneous factors? That's a hard one, huh? Will you be able to answer each research question with data collected in this experiment? So those are things you need to think about while you're designing your experiment. So now please go ahead and complete practice 1. It's a Google form.